Unable to conceive, her husband's family abandoned her in the wilderness until the widowed logger with his 4 young ones discovered her among the frozen pines of the Rocky Mountain. Deuce! Colorado Territory, deep winter. 1889. The oak logs crackled fiercely in the parlor fireplace, throwing dancing shadows across marble floors and burgundy curtains. Outside, fresh snow descended in heavy silence, wrapping the mansion in muffled stillness. Margaret sat rigid on the leather sofa, fingers twisted together, while Victoria Blackwell, her spouse's mother, loomed austere beside the carved mantel, her gaze cutting like steel. Without the ability to produce heirs, Margaret, Victoria declared icily, "What purpose serves the Blackwell legacy through you?" Margaret lifted her chin slowly, voice unwavering despite the ache building in her throat. "I wed your son from devotion." Victoria's laugh held no warmth. Devotion builds no dynasty. Devotion inherits no property or preserves bloodlines. Devotion holds no value in this house. Margaret's eyes drifted toward the flames, hoping desperately that Richard would intervene. He stood beside the hearth, swirling amber whiskey firelight, dancing off his silver watch chain. When he finally spoke, his words cut deeper than winter wind. "Our union served practical ends, Margaret, not romantic ones. Without fulfilling your obligations, why maintain this charade?" She stared in disbelief. "You once promised to cherish me regardless of children." Richard avoided her gaze, sipping his drink, before chuckling darkly. Before Mother clarified the true cost of fruitless sentiment.
All right.
Margaret's breath caught. He stepped closer, removed the brandy glass, and twisted off his wedding band. The gold rang against dark wood as he placed it down. "Let us conclude this arrangement before it becomes a lasting disgrace." She watched the discarded ring. Some part of her waited for regret, a glance, some word of sorrow, but none came. The housemaid entered soundlessly, eyes downcast, holding Margaret's traveling cloak. Nobody offered farewells. Later, Margaret sat in the guest chamber where she'd once stitched window coverings and imagined nursery songs. She gazed at cream-colored walls, the unused rocking cradle tucked away, wondering precisely when her fairy tale had died. She never noticed the hand that mixed powder into her evening tea. Darkness claimed her before tears could fall. She awakened to white everywhere. Snow crystals clung to her eyelashes. Bitter cold gnawed her skin, numbing her extremities. Rose slowly, breath misting, skull throbbing. Pine trees surrounded her in an unfamiliar forest grove. Her traveling coat lay nearby, frost-covered. Beside it sat a rough burlap bag. With shaking fingers, she opened it. Inside, one plain woolen gown, sturdy boots, her purse, now empty and folded paper. Margaret unfolded it with dread. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Victoria. "Return to your proper station." Cry lodged in her throat, but never emerged. She stood on unsteady legs, scanning the endless white stretching in all directions. No footprints, no pathway, no indication of origin or destination. The snowfall intensified. Margaret wrapped her coat tighter and began walking. She shed no tears, made no outcries. Simply moved forward, step by step, into the forest that had claimed her. Wind shrieked through branches, and twilight arrived swiftly. By sunset, her gait grew unsteady. Her hands had lost feeling, lips were splitting, and each breath felt like swallowing shards. Her knees gave way. She collapsed. Snow embraced her like a burial shroud. Before consciousness faded, she whispered, the final word that once meant sanctuary. "Richard." But only the evergreens listened, and they offered no reply. The wind was settling as Samuel Hayes trudged homeward, kindling balanced on his shoulder, worn hatchet in hand. The woodland wore its silver stillness like armor. He'd learned to honor. Such quiet it meant the wilderness was observing. He stopped when something unusual caught his eye beneath the twisted aspen on the hillside. Initially, it appeared to be another snow mound, but then he recognized the form. A woman, motionless, frozen, barely breathing. Samuel dropped his load and approached carefully. Her complexion was ghostly white eyelashes rimmed with ice crystals. Her mouth showed blue tinge. Whoever she was had been exposed far too long. He muttered under his breath. Damn foolishness. Still, he knelt beside her, brushing snow from her features. Her pulse was barely detectable but present. He glanced back through the trees toward home, jaw tight. A small voice interrupted the stillness. Papa, she's still breathing. His youngest daughter rose, stood at the forest edge, wrapped in an oversized jacket, woolen mittens dangling from strings. She regarded the woman with enormous, hopeful eyes. Please, she whispered. Samuel exhaled deeply. Don't collect wanderers. She's not wandering. She's a proper lady. Samuel closed his eyes briefly, then lifted the woman carefully. She felt impossibly light. He carried her down the trail toward the one sanctuary he'd vowed to keep closed to outsiders. The haze. The cabin stood small but sturdy, tucked against a rocky outcropping. Chimney smoke curled upward. Inside, 3 more children watched as their father shouldered through the door, snow-covered and burdened. A stranger? Asked Thomas, the eldest, scowling. From where? Found her up north, Samuel replied. One night only. He placed her on the narrow bed in the rear room, the one still holding his deceased wife's patchwork coverlet folded at the foot. He didn't inquire her name, didn't remove her footwear, simply fed the fire, added more logs, and left heated water. Nearby, later, when the cabin grew silent and children slept, Samuel returned to check. She was fevering, her face flushed scarlet, damp with perspiration. Her lips moved soundlessly. Samuel grumbled something, then fetched a damp cloth and cooled her forehead. Her body convulsed beneath the quilt. No, she whimpered. Easy now, he said, rougher than gentle. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, glassy and unfocused. She couldn't see him, but tears streamed down her cheeks. Samuel paused, cloth in hand, witnessed tears from physical pain. He'd seen men weep from warfare. But this carried something different, something quieter, deeper. Soundless grief. He rose abruptly, walked to the kitchen, ladled broth into a bowl, and returned. He set it near her bedside, then turned to leave. But before departing, he looked back once more. She continued crying silently, lost in delirium. Samuel didn't speak. He simply pulled the coverlet higher over her chest, dimmed the lamp, shut the door behind him. Margaret awakened to wind-rattling glass panes and creaking floorboards outside her room. Momentarily, she forgot her location. Her throat felt parched, limbs stiff as timber, spine aching from cold. But she lived. She blinked slowly, adjusting to pale morning light filtering through frosted windows. The room felt quiet and strange. Bare timber walls, simple shelves holding few containers and folded fabric. A small cast-iron stove crouched. In the corner, its warmth faded but lingering. The single window framed towering pine trees laden with snow. Wind pressed against the glass with gentle persistence, like a youngster tapping softly for entry at the bed's foot. Someone had placed folded cotton fabric, plain but clean, the type worn for labor rather than display. It wasn't hers. She sat up slowly, the coverlet sliding from her shoulders heavily. Movement brought dizziness. Her feet touched floor, and she winced, skin raw, cold still gripping her toes like frostbite awaiting purpose. Even so, she forced herself upright, gripping the wall for support. Each breath required effort. But she wouldn't remain prone. Voices drifted from another room, children's laughter, something bubbling, perhaps soup. A pot clattered, followed by muffled giggles and sharp shushing. She hesitated at the doorway, hand hovering above the handle, pulse quickening. What if they didn't welcome her presence? What if the man who rescued her reconsidered? Before she could retreat, the main door burst open. Thomas stumbled inside, supporting his younger brother Daniel, who appeared limp in his arms. He went to the stream, Thomas called breathlessly, eyes wide with alarm. Barefoot. Margaret's body reacted before thought. She rushed forward, kneeling. Beside the boy, Daniel's face burned bright red, eyes glazed with fever. His teeth chattered, small hands trembling. Wet clothing clung to his slight frame, lips showing blue tint. "It's burning up," Margaret said. "He's soaked through." She turned to the room. "Where's the firewood?" "Owls, boiling water, mint, or chamomile. Anything." The children stared as if a spirit had begun speaking. Rose finally darted away. "I'll get the kettle." Margaret gathered Daniel in her arms. His skin blazed against hers, the contrast making her shiver. She carried him to the room she'd vacated, laying him on the still warm bed. Her fingers worked quickly, stripping wet garments, wrapping him in every available blanket, and hurrying back to stoke the fire. She found jars on the shelf, one containing dried spearmint, another marked wild oregano. She crushed the herbs between her palms, releasing sharp, familiar fragrance, and poured boiling water over them. The aroma filled the room like returning memories. She dipped cloth into the mixture, wrung it out, and pressed it gently to Daniel's chest. Then she began humming, low, tentative, an old lullaby from childhood. Her voice cracked initially, but she continued. "Hush now, little darling. The tempest's passing by. Mother's here beside you, starlight in your eyes. Don't weep. No, don't weep. Mother's going to sing till dawn draws nigh." Daniel's breathing steadied. His eyelids grew heavy. Then, in a voice so soft she nearly missed it, he whispered, "Mother used to sing that tune." Margaret's hands stilled, lips parted, but words wouldn't come. Daniel reached out, tiny fingers, curling around hers. "I remember that melody." She blinked rapidly, pressing his hand gently. From the doorway, Samuel watched silently, arms crossed, expression unreadable, though his jaw clenched with unspoken emotion. When Daniel finally drifted into peaceful sleep, Margaret brushed the boy's hair back and turned to leave. Samuel hadn't moved. Their eyes met no words, only that quiet, weighted gaze before he disappeared into the kitchen. Moments later, he returned, setting a steaming cup of spearmint tea on the table beside her before walking away. No gratitude expected, no apology. Offered just that small gesture, wordless, warm, and meaningful beyond any eloquent speech she'd ever heard. Margaret remained. Not because anyone requested it, but because nobody asked her to depart. Each morning she rose before fires were lit. Her hands, once soft from urban luxuries, grew red and rough from melted snow and lye soap. She swept cabin floors with pine needles, stirred porridge over the hearth until thick, and scrubbed linens in cold basins while breath clouded in early light. Her movements stayed quiet, her presence gentler than wind, moving through trees. She trimmed Thomas's unruly hair while he squirmed, braided Rose's locks with ribbon strips torn from an old shirt. She mended Peter's worn stockings without being asked, and taught Daniel to tie his boots twice so they wouldn't loosen in snow. She never intruded, never sought thanks, simply filled spaces that had remained empty since the children's mother died, bringing attention that felt like sunlight through shutters initially. Children called her Miss Margaret with uncertainty, testing the name against air. Then, with greater ease, finally with affection, they began bringing her pine cones and polished stones. Rose tucked wildflowers behind her ear. Thomas left half-eaten biscuits by her bedside. Even Peter, who rarely spoke beyond grunts, began. Lingering near when she read aloud evenings, Samuel remained a quiet presence in the background. He chopped wood and repaired the roof after the latest storm. He hunted silently, returning with game and preserved meat for the stew pot. But Margaret noticed things. Every few days, someone had stacked freshly cut logs beneath her window. Fire never sputtered. Her water bucket never froze, and when her wash basin handle broke, it was replaced before nightfall with a newer, smoother one carved by hand. Samuel never thanked her, never praised. But when he passed her by the hearth, or handed her a tin cup of tea, his fingers brushed hers longer than necessary. Not much, but enough. Then came whispers. The town was small. Gossip grew like moss damp and persistent. The loggers hiding a woman in the woods. She's probably some runaway from the war, or worse, living with 4 children and no ring on her. Finger scandalous. Samuel heard it when he rode into town to trade furs. He didn't respond, didn't even flinch. But when supplies ran low and snow began melting, he needed to return. This time with a wagon. Margaret stood at the door, arms folded, shawl tight around shoulders. "I'm coming," she declared. "The children need new footwear." Samuel hesitated. His eyes searched hers, unreadable. Then he nodded once. The wagon creaked. Over thawing roads and back, children huddled under blankets. Margaret sat near front, one hand resting on a basket of dried herbs she'd saved from helping neighbors. Town buzzed with activity, muddy streets. Wagons groaning, voices calling bargains. From windows. When Margaret stepped down, holding Daniel's hand, the street slowed. Conversations quieted, eyes turned, the woman with no ring. Too refined, they thought, for the mountain, but she stood tall, and for children, cheeks wind-chapped and hands curled in hers, clung to her like roots to soil. Inside the general store, she helped Peter choose pencils. She selected sky blue fabric for Rose's new dress. She found a book of stories for Thomas and examined boots for Daniel's small feet. At the counter, the shopkeeper squinted. "You the new Hayes woman?" Margaret smiled. "No, sir. It's just helping with the children."
Oh.
Then from the doorway, a high voice rang out, "Mama?" Daniel came running, a wooden toy clutched in his hand. He threw his arms around her leg and looked up sheepishly. "I meant Miss Margaret." The room went still. Margaret blinked, but her face softened. She knelt and kissed the crown of his head. "It's perfectly fine," she whispered. Outside, Samuel loaded flour sacks into the wagon. A man nearby leaned against the post and snorted. "Looks like you acquired yourself a new wife." Samuel didn't look up. "She's not mine." The man smirked. "Sure doesn't appear that way." Samuel turned. "Then she may not be mine," he said, voice low but steady. "But she's the finest thing they've had in years." The man fell quiet. When Margaret stepped outside, children ran two hurdy hands, excited. Voices, embracing arms. She knelt to greet them, gathered them all close, and for the first time the townspeople saw her not as scandal, not as mystery, but as something far more sacred. Spring crept across the mountain like whispered prayer. Snow retreated into pines. The creek began murmuring again, and buds stretched fingers toward sun. At the Hayes cabin, warmth no longer came only from hearth, but from small things: Margaret's gentle humming while kneading bread, Rose's laughter, echoing through trees, Daniel falling asleep with his head on her lap as she read aloud. It had been weeks since anyone mentioned where Margaret originated, longer still since anyone wondered where she might go. One morning, Peter returned from supply run with letter in hand, wax seal still unbroken. "It bears your name," he muttered, handing it to Margaret like it burned his fingers. Margaret stood still. The seal was deep crimson, handwriting elegant and unmistakably familiar. Blackwell. She felt her heart beat slow in strange, heavy rhythm. With careful fingers, she peeled it open, unfolded the paper, and read, "Margaret, mother is failing. The family estate requires you, requires stability. You remain my wife legally. Return, and all shall be restored. This family stands ready to welcome you home, Richard." No apology, no warmth, just summons, disguised as duty. Tucked inside was something else, a small velvet pouch. She opened it with dread. The ring, the same gold band Victoria had stripped from her hand without ceremony, now returned like a command. Margaret closed the letter slowly. All day she said nothing. She folded the note, hid it in her apron pocket, and continued as if the words hadn't shattered something quiet inside her. But Samuel noticed he always did. She caught him watching her that evening, his gaze lingering longer than it should as she stirred pot over stove. When she set the table, she felt the silence between them like cold draft beneath the door. Children were quieter too, and Rose clung to her side while they washed dishes. Daniel peered at her with wide, uncertain eyes. Peter didn't speak at all. Later, when children climbed aloft, Margaret stayed by fire, hands folded in lap. She hadn't reread the letter. She didn't need to. Samuel sat in his usual chair, whittling a small wooden fox. Flames crackled between them. Margaret pulled the letter from her pocket and unfolded it once more, holding it up to firelight. Her eyes didn't move across words. She wasn't reading this time. She was remembering the cold marble of that parlor, Victoria's voice like flint, Richard's indifference, the sting of the ring pulled from her finger. Samuel glanced at her, then just a flick of eyes, but his gaze landed on the ring now cradled in her palm. He didn't ask, didn't press, just returned to whittling. Margaret stood. The room was still. Air smelled of cedar and ash. She walked to fireplace. One by one, she tore the letter into even strips. The paper was thick, expensive. It resisted. But she kept tearing until it was unreadable. Then she dropped pieces into fire. They curled, blackened, disappeared. The ring came last. She looked at it for one long moment, gold catching firelight before letting it fall from her fingers. Landed with quiet clink, then vanished beneath coals. Samuel set whittling knife down. "Why?" he asked softly. Margaret turned. Fire danced behind her, warming her face, but her voice was steady and low. "'Cause this is the first place someone called me mother." She didn't cry, didn't explain, simply sat in the chair across from him, folded her hands again, and stared into fire like it was the only home she'd ever known. Samuel nodded once, small but sure. He didn't say another word. Didn't need to. Life at the cabin didn't change all at once. There were no grand declarations whispered beneath stars. No dramatic embraces against barn doors or sudden sweeping dances in candlelight. No wedding bells. No promises written in ink. There was only rhythm small. Ordinary days stitched quietly together like well-mended quilt. Samuel began building things. Not for show, not for thanks. First, a small wooden table just outside the garden, carved, with winding vines and morning glories like ones Margaret had planted in spring. She used it to sort seeds and dry herbs. Then came a new window frame beside the bed. The bed she once feared to sleep in, angled precisely to catch slice of sunrise, she said, reminded her of Carolina mornings. One day while stirring stew, looked up to find narrow shelf above stove. It held her jar spearmint, wild oregano, lavender buds each, one labeled in Samuel's square. Precise handwriting. He never said he built these things for her. She never asked. They didn't speak of love. They didn't speak of anything they couldn't hold in their hands. But their lives began blending slowly and without ceremony. Margaret no longer slept in back room. It started with a storm, one of those bitter spring nights where wind howls through cracks like ghosts. And cold comes not from snow, but from memory of it. Window in her room cracked under pressure. Samuel had stood at threshold, silent, then simply pulled back quilt on his bed. No words, no questions. She lay beside him that night, listening to storm, her breath sinking to rise and fall of his chest. She never returned to other room by mid-spring. There was no longer his space and hers. There was only theirs. They cooked side by side, sat together evenings, children sprawled around their feet. They took turns chopping wood, milking goat, tending crooked rows of vegetables behind cabin. She hummed when washing clothes. He whistled softly when working lathe. One afternoon, Margaret knelt beside raspberry bush, trimming brittle vines that no longer bore fruit. She was focused, unaware that thorns had broken through her gloves, working deep into fingers. Not until she saw drops of blood on leaves did she pause. Samuel saw first. He crossed garden in 3 strides and crouched beside her. Without word, he reached for her hand. She expected scolding, maybe gruff. "You should have been more careful." Instead, he held her hand in both of his gently. His touch was rough, but steady. He began plucking each thorn out slow, careful, focused. When they were all gone, he brought her fingers to his lips and breathed on wounds to cool the sting. Then, wrapping her hand in soft cloth, he held it second, longer than needed. Margaret looked up. His face gave nothing away, but his hands did. They always did. That was how he loved her, not with promises, but with presence. Still the mountain demanded much. Soil was hard. Roof leaked with every storm. Children grew faster than shoes could contain them. There was never enough sleep, never enough quiet. Margaret gave more than she should have. She took in other children, taught lessons late into dusk, helped with chores before sun had properly risen. One morning, as she stepped into yard to gather eggs, world tilted. Her knees buckled. She dropped basket and hit ground hard, eggs breaking around her like pale suns. Rose screamed. Samuel reached her first. He lifted her into his arms as though she weighed nothing, carried her into cabin, and laid her on there. Bed. He piled quilts over her, stoked fire, barked quiet orders to children, and sat by her side. She was burning with fever. There was no physician for miles, no medicine but herbs and time. Samuel never left room. He cooled her forehead, spooned broth into her mouth, wiped sweat from her collarbones. Near midnight, Margaret stirred. "I'm sorry," she whispered weakly. Samuel shook his head, voice low, grave. "You don't apologize for giving more than you had." She reached for his hand. He took it and held it like something sacred. Then, after a long moment, he spoke truth that had haunted him since day he found her in snow. "If you were my wife," he said softly, "I'd never allow you to be left in the cold." Margaret's eyes shimmered not. With pain, but with knowing, because somehow, even without vows or rings, she already was. By time summer painted hills in gold and green, sound of children's laughter echoed far beyond trees. Margaret had transformed a forgotten corner of cabin into something alive. She cleared cobwebs, swept floors smooth with pine branches, and nailed broken piece of slate to wall. Her fingers blackened with soot, used charred sticks from hearth as chalk. She taught from memory scripture verses, folk stories, bits of poetry passed down by her grandmother, simple arithmetic carved into old wood beside window. At first it was only Samuel's 4. Then 2 more arrived thin boys from Homestead over Ridge. Their clothes were patched, their eyes weary. But they listened closely when she read about courage and kindness. Then girl came no shoes. No parents, just 3 miles of dust clinging, 2 ankles and stubborn glint in eyes. "I want to learn my name," she said, "the real way, with letters." Margaret let her sit by stove and gave her warmest blanket. They sat on crates, straw bales, old rugs. Margaret rang makeshift bell bent. Spoon tied to horseshoe end began each day with story that settled even rowdiest child. Her voice, low and certain, wove through timbers like bird song. Mountain began to listen. Word spread, soft as wind through pine. The logger's cabin had become school. The mountain schoolhouse, they called it, named for Margaret's morning ritual, of standing at door, bell in hand, smile ready. One afternoon, bent woman from Southern Valley arrived, with bundle wrapped in worn linen. She handed it to Margaret without ceremony. "My sister taught in Virginia before the war," she said. "Never had children of her own, but she taught hundreds." Inside bundle was silk scarf, pale yellow, frayed at corners, still smelling faintly of jasmine. Margaret held it to her cheek, eyes misting. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, she tied it into her hair as she read by candlelight, her voice glowing with gratitude. Then came boy from orphanage, silent, thin, wild-eyed. He said nothing for 3 days, sat in corner, arms crossed, watching others read and laugh and trace letters in ash on wood. Margaret let him be. On 4th day, as class gathered books and scattered outside, he stayed behind. He stared at chalk for a long while, then walked forward, uncertain. His hands trembled. Then suddenly, he opened his arms and reached for her. Margaret knelt slowly, unsure, until he wrapped arms around her waist and buried face in her apron. "Mother," he whispered, voice barely audible, cracking like thin ice. Margaret froze. Word hit her like thunder. Her throat tightened, heart pressed against ribs. Slowly, she bent down, gathered him close, and whispered into his hair, "I'm right here." Tears rolled freely down her cheeks. "I'm not going anywhere." A year had passed, though forest seemed timeless. Cabin had grown fuller not in size, but in soul. Where once there was silence, now there was music, laughter, bickering over spoons and books. bare feet running across wooden floors. Dining table had been rebuilt by Samuel's hand, sturdier, longer. 8 chairs now stood around it. 4. His children, 3 Mountain students who had nowhere else to go, and one at head where Margaret always sat, carving bread and ladling stew with hands that once trembled, but no longer did. No one asked why she stayed. She simply did. Samuel, never one for words, had found other ways. One winter morning, Margaret stepped outside and found wind chime hanging over porch, delicate and charming, fashioned from old silver spoons. They clinked together gently in breeze, each tone soft and distinct. She turned to find Samuel behind her, watching quietly. He rubbed back of neck. "Each spoon," he said, "is gratitude I never managed to voice." Margaret didn't speak. I just reached up and touched one gently, eyes shining, behind cabin. She had begun carving names into thin planks of wood, each child who came through their door, each soul who found safety here. She nailed them to great pine near garden. Tree stood tall like living record of love that grew without permission. Peter's name, Thomas's, roses, painted with hearts. Daniel's beneath carved bare. Then came orphan Sarah, Nathan, Ruthind, one small plaque just above rest. Margaret's tree. When snow returned and world went quiet again, cabin remained hearth and storm. There was no wedding, no paper, no preacher, but there were 4 bowls already set before Margaret sat down. There was coat hung beside Samuel's on rack. There was quiet hand that reached for hers when wind howled outside, and that was all she had ever wanted. One evening, fire burned warm and slow. Margaret sat in rocking chair, 3 children curled around her feet. She read aloud from memory fables, poems, stories stitched from her own heart. Children's heads drooped against her lap, full bellies and safe dreams. Outside, Samuel worked at woodpile, breath white in air, saw carving through silence like lullaby. Silver spoons above door swayed gently in wind, ringing out their quiet. Chorus. Inside cabin, Margaret closed book, kissed each forehead and whispered, "Sleep well, my loves." Camera pulls back from window. Warm light spills through glass. Forest hums in quiet harmony. A voice speaks soft, certain, true. She could not bear children, but she carried love, and that was more than enough. If this story touched your heart, if Margaret's quiet strength, Samuel's silent devotion, and the children's laughter left something warm in your soul, then you're one of us. Here on Mountain Tales, we tell stories where love isn't always loud, but it always endures. So if you believe that even in coldest woods, love can still be found, hit subscribe, give this story a like, and share it with someone who believes in second chances, because out here in dust and snow, love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing each other over and over again. We'll see you next time, where hearts still run wild.